My name is Michael Yusuf,
And my name is Saul Arafi.
and this is our CSC4710 database project.
Oh, we should have said that at the same time. That would have been cute. Let's keep going.
To begin, I'm going to start off by showing off the index.jsp. This is going to be the page you see when you begin the program. So when I run the index.jsp on the server, you see this page, and it's titled the online store. The part I want to talk about is the initialization of the database. So here you can see when you have this initialized database text, it'll reference you to the initialize on the control servlet. So on the control servlet, when it reads that it's going to initialize, it is going to run the function initialize database. And in this function initialize database, it creates all the tables that we plan to use for our project, and it populates all of those tables with some information just to begin with. So here you can see, let me talk about the users DAO. We have the users DAO create table and users DAO populate table. At the beginning of the program, we create the users DAO object based on the users DAO Java file. So in the users DAO, first let me talk about this generic DAO that I have that applies to every data access object in this project. So every data access object is going to have a connection function which connects to our database like so. It'll get the JDBC and then it'll connect to the database using these parameters. And there's also a disconnect function where it'll just close that connection. In the user's DAO, it uses these methods. So when it creates a table, it uses the connect function to connect to the database. And then it uses this statement right here in order to create the table. So it starts by dropping the table if it exists, and then creating the table with user ID as the primary key, email, password, first name, last name, gender, and age. And it creates them exactly how it's described in this statement right here, and then it closes the statement. And then there's also, as you can see, the populate function in the user's DAO. And when we call that, it is going to have a prepared statement that will insert into the user's table email, username, user, password, first name, last name, gender, and age. And here we just have 10 different tuples to insert into the table with just some data. So for example, we have the root user with the root name, password as pass1234, root first name, root last name, NA as their gender, and 0 as their age. And then that's just repeated 10 times over for each of the other users we populate the user table with. And in the user class, we can see that this is simply a class in Java, so we can have a way to store data from the table in Java. In the control servlet, you see we have DAOs for each of the other things, and they're mostly the same. It drops the table if it exists, creates a new table, and then populates it with some random items, just for the sake of having them there. And after it does that in the population, it'll close it, and that's it for initializing the database. It does that for each of the tables, and then it redirects you to the index.jsp. So as you can see, when I click initialize database, it does all the connections, closes them all, and in our database we have those values in there. So now I'm going to pass it off to Salar to talk about the web pages themselves.
Okay, so for my part, I mainly worked on the login and registration pages, as well as their functionality. So if we just start the program from index.jsp, so we can see we are presented with this initial screen, and we have the options of either going to login or registration. So if I go into registration, and I'll just register myself. So Solar for first name, Rafi for last name, male, and we, rather than inputting a string into the age field, we just force the user to increment this just to make sure that they input, or just to make sure that an integer value is passed. And then email, I'll just put my email. And password, I'll just create a password called password. And then once I submit it, it's going to take me to the login page with a message, registration success. Now, if I log in myself, I should have a successful login with the same credentials that I registered with. I submit, and it takes us to the login successful page. And we always have ways of moving or traversing throughout or forward and back in our web pages. So if I go to login, I can go back to home. If I go to registration, I can go back to home. Now, if I were to log in with invalid credentials, so just a random string for the email and a random password, and I submit that, it'll prompt us with the login failed, and it'll just keep us on the login page. Similarly, if I go to registration, and there are a couple checks we have here. If we try to submit without entering any values, it basically forces us to fill out the values. And if I register as a user that already exists, it could be even a different age. And whatever password. It shows that we failed to register up here, and it keeps us on the registration page. So let me just exit out of that, and going to the control servlet.java page, you see that we have two methods here, one for registration, attempt registration, and one for attempt login. So in attempt registration, basically I set the various parameters, or I retrieve the various parameters from the HTML or the JSP page and insert them into the corresponding variables. And then I make the function call from the user's DAO file, which is this one, or not this one, that's the right one, yeah. Okay, so I make the function call with by passing the parameters that I initialized here. So if the function returns true, that means the registration was successful, and it will start a session for the user. And this session's main purpose is to set this string as registration success. And then we have the same thing here. If registration fails, it sets the string to registration failed. And that is located here, where we basically test whether the string is populated. If it's not populated, then we populate the string with the appropriate message, and then we remove the string. But it'll show up on the user's page once they successfully or fail to log in. So going to the user DAO.java page, those parameters are passed in. We connect to the server. We have a prepared statement here with this SQL statement and these parameters to populate. And then we populate them down here with setString. email, first name, last name, password, age, and then we execute the query. Then we close that out, disconnect the server, or disconnect from the server. Now, if for whatever reason this didn't work, so if there was a user that was already in the database with those credentials, then we would move down here and basically print out the error and return false. Otherwise, we return true. So now, once the user has registered, then they would attempt to log in, and they would be invoking this method where we basically pass the parameters from the JSP file, email and password, into the corresponding variables email and password, and then invoke the user valid function in the user DAO page, which is right here. And if, I should also mention that if it's a successful registration, that the user will be redirected to this login.jsp page with this printed out in the console. And if it's a failed registration, then they would be basically redirected back to the same page showing this error message, registration failed. So the kind of similar stuff happened in attempt to login. So once those parameters are populated, the parameters are passed to this function, is user valid. And here, we again connect to the server. We keep track of we have this flag, user exists, so that'll come in handy in a bit. So we prepare this statement, populate those parameters, email and password, and then we execute the query. And this if block right here, query result.next, basically tests whether or not a user with those credentials are in the database. If so, we set the flag to true, close the connection, and basically disconnect. And if there was an error, then we would pass that error onto the catch block here. And here we return the value of the flag. So if there was a user in the database and we had set that to true, we would pass true back to our method here. Okay, so then if the login was successful, it would pass back true to this if statement, and this code would execute where the user is, we create the session and we redirect the user back to a login successful page. If the function returns false, that means the user was not in the database, failed login, and so we would create that session, give the login failed message into the JSP file, and we would basically redirect them back to the login page with that message present. And yeah, that's basically it.